that is differences between macro differs from the subroutines. We can discuss what is the macros and what is the subroutines. Now we are familiar with the subroutine. Actually, we can consider the repeated code in a small set of, or we consider a repeated code in a particular set of program or a set of unit. We can consider it is a subroutine, or we can, in other words, we can consider the macros. Now, first difference can be given here. Macros differ from the subroutine in one fundamental respect. That is, we can consider here, if we want to use a small set of repeated code, then we consider the macro. Okay, and if we want to use a large number of code which is repeated in your program, then at that time we need to consider the subroutine. Now, use of the macro name in the mnemonic field of an assembly statement leads to its expansion. Okay, when we use the macro names in our program, at that time we consider the expansion of the macros. We need that program requires the expansion of that macros. But when we consider, that is, whereas we use the subroutine name in the call instruction leads to its execution. Okay, now in this case here what happened, that is, control will be transferred to that of the function. Here when we use the function or when we use the subroutines, there is no expansion can be done at the call instruction. Okay, there is no replacement of the call instruction with the corresponding subroutine unit statements. But in case of the macro, it happens. That is, where macro name is appear as a mnemonic field, then that macro name will be replaced with the corresponding statement of that macro. Like this here we consider. So the main difference in the size and execution efficiency can be given in macro and subroutine. Now, what is the size? In this case, our program size will be increased when we consider the macro. Okay, because macro will be expanded before the compilation, before the execution. Therefore, our source program size will be increased, and accordingly the memory also increase for that particular program code. Now, in case of subroutines, size of the programs remains constant, because here we can consider the execution. Here we can consider the function call. We transfer the control, that is, the compiler or the execution system will transfer the control to that function definition. So size of the size of our source program will remains same. Now in this case here, execution efficiency will execution efficiency is less, because time of the execution is increases. In case of the macro, execution time will be reduced, because there is no transmission of a control from one place to the another place can be done. Okay, that's why macro can be executed faster than that of the subroutines, and subroutines require more time for the execution because of this execution efficiency. That means when call statement of the function is occur, then control will be transferred to that particular location where the function definition is available. Again, subroutine execute completely, control get back where it called that particular subroutine. Okay, this transmission time will be increased between that particular subroutines. Now after that, macro can be said to trade program in said program size for execution efficiency. More difference would be discussed at the time of discussion of macro expansion. आणखी काही macro expansion होत असताना आणखी काही गोष्टी आपल्याला त्यामध्ये deeply study करायचे. Now we can see some other differences at the time of macro expansion. Now next thing here we can consider is that the macro definition and macro that is call. Okay, what is the macro definition and call of the macro, how it will be differ, or how we can consider it. Here we can consider only the thing is macro definition and corresponding call. This statement is not given here. Now we can consider what is the macro definition and how we can call the macro. Okay, in this case here we can represent that macro definition is enclosed between a macro header statement and macro end statement. That is, when we start the definition of the macro, for that purpose we require the macro header and macro end statement. That means macro, okay, it is the macro header, and end, it is the end of the macro. Between these two statement, we can write the definition of your macro. That is, we can write complete definition of that particular macro. Those statements who are repeated in our program, all these statements are added into that particular macro and end statement. These are the two statements which is given in that particular header definition and end of that particular macro. Now, macro definition are typically located at the start of the program when our macro where we write that particular macro, that is at the time of your program. When we write a complete program, before writing the program, we need to define the macro. We write the definition of that macro, and then we can use that particular complete program. Because of when we can have a definition of macro, then we can use that particular macro name in your source program. Okay, जेव्हा आपल्याला कंप्लीट प्रोग्राम लिहायचा असतो त्यावेळेस त्या कंप्लीट प्रोग्राम मध्ये ती मॅक्रो त्यावेळेस ऍड केलं जाईल. ओके, ती डेफिनेशन ऑलरेडी एक्झिस्ट असणं गरजेचं आहे. ती जर डेफिनेशन एक्झिस्ट असेल तरच आपल्याला ते नेम त्या ठिकाणी काय करता येतं, पुढे मॅक्रोचं मॅक्रो कॉल स्टेटमेंट त्या ठिकाणी राईट करता येतं. दॅट इज व्हेन वी यूज our high level languages, we can declare the variable before they can use. Okay, we can define the function before it can call. आपण जसं रेग्युलरली फंक्शन कॉल करण्या अगोदर त्याला डिक्लेअर करावं लागतं. त्याची डिक्लेरेशन प्रोटोटाइप त्या ठिकाणी दिलं जातं, भले डेफिनेशन तुम्ही नंतर लिहिलेली असेल. ओके, but here we need to consider the definition of macro before writing our complete program. Now, when we consider the macro definition, which consists the macro prototype statement, okay, then one or more model statement, and next thing is macro preprocessor statements. Now, what are these particular statements? How these statements will be identified in your program? That will be considered in the next section. Okay, macro prototype statements. Second thing is nothing but the one or more model statement, and third thing is nothing but the macro preprocessor statement. We can combine these three statements to define a particular macro. Okay, now in this case, the macro prototype statement declares the name of the macro and the name and kind of its parameters. Just like our prototype, or just like our subroutines, we can pass some parameter to the function. Like that, we can pass some parameters to the macro also. How we can pass that macros? Now it has a specific syntax. See this particular syntax, that is the macro name. Here we write the formal parameter specifiers. Okay, formal parameter specification can be given here. We can consider this formal parameter because we consider this parameter in the definition of macro. Here we can consider two types of the parameter. One is nothing but the formal parameter, and another one is nothing but the actual parameter. Now, when we call the macro, at that time we can use the actual parameter. When we define the macro, at that time we can use the formal parameter. Now we can differentiate these two, just like our function parameters. We can see in high level language, we in that case also we can consider two types of that parameter. When function is called, at that time we can consider the actual parameter will be passed to that calling function, and when we write the definition of that function, we can consider the formal parameter at that particular definition space. Now in this case also we can consider the formal and actual parameter. When we write the definition of the macro, at that time we specify the name of the given macro, and then we can specify the formal parameter list here. Now this square bracket represents the optional part. If we don't have any parameters required in the macro, then we don't use this particular parameter representation. That is, we only mention the name of the macro. Okay, now here macro name appears in the mnemonic field of the assembly statement, and formal parameter specify is of the form. दोन टाइपचे parameter इथे देता येतात, and parameter name. We can mention this type of parameters with the help of this particular representation, and this and will be represented here. When we mention the particular parameter name, parameter kind, which type of parameter will be given there. Parameter kind in the sense that is, it is a keyword parameter, it is a positional parameter, or it is the default parameter. This type of parameter kinds will be considered at the time of macro definition. We can consider all these things in case of the macro definition. We can see this particular example. We can consider macro. This is the first directive. Macro is the header statement. Okay, m end, it is nothing but the end of the macro. M end statement, it is one of the end statement, macro end statement. In this case, swap and a and b are the prototype statement. This statement is called as the prototype statement in the sense that is, we can consider the name of macro and corresponding parameters of that macro. Now here we can consider this prototype statement because of that is, just we consider our subroutine or our function. When we write the definition of the function, at that time we need to specify the particular prototype or header of that function. Okay, when we mention the header of the function, that header statement is called as the prototype of that particular function. Here also we can specify the name of the macro and the corresponding parameter list. We can call this type of statement as a prototype statement. Here and A and B are nothing but the parameters passed to that swap macro. Swap is the name of the given macro. Now this is nothing but the body of macro, or model statement can be given here, which modifies the particular values of our symbols, our variables. That's why we call it as a model statement. They can perform some action, they can perform some task under that particular macro. This is the body of the macro, from move r a register and a, move r b register and b, move m a register and b, move m b register and a. These are nothing but the model statements comes under the swap macro. Here m end statement, the end of the macro. We compulsory consider the macro, which is the starting or header statement, and m end, where our macro will be end. If m end statement is not identified in the macro, at that time we consider complete statement अंडर दॅट पर्टिक्युलर मॅक्रो. जर आपल्याला इथे मॅक्रोचं एम एंड स्टेटमेंट मिळालं नाही तर त्या ठिकाणी मॅक्रोची डेफिनेशन कंप्लीट होत नाही. दॅट्स वाय वी स्टार्ट द मॅक्रो विथ मॅक्रो स्टेटमेंट अँड वी एंड द मॅक्रो विथ एम एंड प्रोटोटाइप स्टेटमेंट. ओके, एम एंड स्टेटमेंट. Under these two statements, we can consider all this part is nothing but the body of that macro after the name of the macro given. Now, next thing here, we can consider how we can call the macro. Macro is called by writing the macro name in the mnemonic field. Okay, we just simply call the macro by giving swap and the corresponding parameter. Okay, swap, it is the name of the macro, and we can pass here parameter a comma b. These two parameters will be considered as actual parameter when we call the swap macro. At this point, a and b are nothing but the formal parameter. Okay, this location of the parameter is nothing but the formal parameter in case of the definition. But when we call the parameter, at that time we can consider there as a actual parameter specification. मॅक्रो डेफिनेशन मध्ये किती फॉर्मल पॅरामीटर दिले तेवढे ऍक्च्युअल पॅरामीटर तुम्हाला इथनं काय करावं लागतात, पास करावं लागतात. नाउ दिस इज नथिंग बट द सिंटॅक्स टू कॉल द मॅक्रो. दॅट इज मॅक्रो नेम अँड वी कॅन पास हियर actual parameter. If we don't have any parameter to the macro name macro, then this part will be considered as a optional part, and we simply give the name of that macro. Now here, where the actual parameter resembles an operand or specification in an assembly language statement, for example macro m end are the macro header and macro end statement. Macro and m end statement जे आहे ते मॅक्रो हेडर म्हणून वापरलं जाईल, आणि एम एंड मॅक्रो एंड जिथे मॅक्रो एंड होतो त्यासाठी एम एंड स्टेटमेंट यूज केलं जाईल. नाउ हियर द प्रोटोटाइप स्टेटमेंट इंडिकेट्स दॅट 3 parameters called as MEM val, INCR val, and REG exist for the macro. Now this is the another example which will be shown here. Now you can see that particular example from where this will be considered. Now you are visible this particular string page or not? Are you visible this macro INCR and MEM val, INCR val, comma, and REG? Okay, this screen we are not sure. This is the swapping macro. These values will be taken from another example. I will show that example in next after some time. Now, since we can consider this parameter kind is not specified for any of the parameters, इथे कुठल्याही प्रकारचे parameterचे types mention केलेले नाहीत. Now they are all of the default kind, that is the positional parameters. Okay, if you don't specify the kind of the parameter, इथे पण आपण कुठल्याच टाइपचे पॅरामीटर मेन्शन केले नाही, कोणत्या काइंडचे पॅरामीटर आहेत ते मेन्शन केलेले नाही. दॅट्स वाय वी कॉल दिस टाइप ऑफ पॅरामीटर ॲज अ positional parameters. Okay, now here the statement with the operation codes moar, add, movem, that is nothing but here we can consider the moar, movem. We can have some other statement, that is add, subtract, or we can consider branch on condition, basic conditions. Those of course or operations are comes under this macro are nothing but the model statements. Okay, now no preprocessor statements are used in this particular macro. There is no one or any type of preprocessor statement can be considered under this particular example. Now we can compare this example that is previous one or this also. There is no example or there is no pre-processor statement can be added at that point. Now we can see this one more example, that is a swapping macro can be given here. आता मी तुम्हाला आधी जे एक्झाम्पल दाखवलं होतं त्या ठिकाणी फक्त मॅक्रोची डेफिनेशन होती, बट हाऊ वी कॅन कॉल द मॅक्रो. नाउ वी कॅन सी दिस कंप्लीट एक्झाम्पल हियर. मॅक्रो स्टार्ट विथ मॅक्रो स्टेटमेंट, swap and a and b, these are the positional parameters. We can perform the swapping of variable a and variable b with the help of this particular model statement, that is nothing but the macro definition, and here our macro will be end. Now after ending this particular macro we can start our actual code. आपला प्रोग्राम त्या ठिकाणी तिथून पुढे स्टार्ट झालेला. नाउ इन दिस केस व्हाट हॅपन, दॅट इज स्टार्ट 100, read x, read y. We read two variable, two values. Now swap x comma y. Here swap definition or calling of the macro will occur at this particular point. Here x and y are nothing but the actual parameter, whereas swap and a and b are nothing but the formal parameters. Now what happens when this macro is called? All the statements from this move r a register, move r b register, move m a register, move m b register are replaced with swap x comma y. Okay, at this particular point macro expansion can be takes place. That means what happened, that is these four statements are put at this single line. Okay, and then we can print the value of x and print the value of y. What happened in this case, that is the value of x will be assigned to the value of y and value of y which is assigned to the value of x. That means swapping will be takes place. Okay, at that time we can consider, or in this particular location we can consider the calling of that macro. इथे मॅक्रो जिथे कॉल होतो तिथे काय होणार, तुमच्या हे स्टेटमेंट जे आहेत ते स्टेटमेंट रिप्लेस होतात. त्यामुळे काय झालं, प्रोग्रामच्या साईज मध्ये तुम्हाला करंटली स्टेटमेंट किती दिसत आहेत, 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10 स्टेटमेंटचा प्रोग्राम आहे. बट व्हेन मॅक्रो विल एक्सपांड 4 स्टेटमेंट विल बी इन्क्रीज. हे 4 स्टेटमेंट काय होतात तुमच्या सोर्स प्रोग्राम मध्ये इन्क्रीज होतात, म्हणजे एक स्टेटमेंट रिप्लेस होईल तुमच्या ह्या 4 स्टेटमेंटने. दॅट मीन्स टोटल 13 लाईन विल बी created when preprocessor macro preprocessor will execute, or that macro will be expanded. Okay, in this way we can consider the definition of the macro and calling to that of the macro. Now how this expansion will be takes place, or in which way that expansion will be performed, we discuss that expansion of macro. There are two types of the macro expansion. We discuss these two types of the macro expansion in next lecture. Now today we can conclude our lecture at this particular point. Okay.